Hello, in this video I'd like to talk about the book Why Don't Students Like School by Daniel Willingham. This is a book written by a cognitive scientist for mainly K-12 teachers, but any educator in general, with the idea of identifying bits of cognitive science, things that we know about how the brain learns that can be useful for improving our teaching within the classroom. So this book is organized around 9 principles from cognitive science, making up the 9 chapters of the book. In order to be included, these principles were chosen to be universal, so not just true in the laboratory setting, but also true within our highly complicated classrooms. These principles have to have a big impact on learning. There has to be a large body of research supporting these principles, not just a few published studies, but it has to be something that's widely agreed upon within cognitive science, and it has to tell us something new about teaching. It has to tell us to do something new in the way that we teach. The goal of this book is to change the way that K-12 teachers teach, and if we talk about things that tell us to do things that we're already doing or tell us things that we already know, that's not particularly helpful to that goal. And in order to meet this goal of making as big an impact as possible on the way teaching is done, it is aimed at a pop audience of K-12 teachers in 2009. So for instance, when Willingham wants to talk about the cognitive processes of an expert, he's going to talk about the cognitive processes of House MD from the television show. This can take a little bit of getting used to if you're used to reading academic articles about teaching, but I think it really makes the book as widely accessible as possible, which is really the goal here. Each chapter of the book, in addition to being based around a particular principle of cognitive science, is based around a question, and chapter 1 is based around the titular, Why Don't Students Like School? And Willingham's answer to this is that it's because thinking is an unpleasant thing to do, and he talks about how thinking happens within the brain, and in particular, how we tend to avoid thinking. So what even is thinking? Well, thinking is the process of combining information together in new ways. So combining information from our observations of the environment, information that we have in long-term memory, and also procedures that we have in long-term memory. And we take all of this information and we put it together into our working memory, and then we process it there, and then hopefully we get an answer. And the great thing about this book is that Willingham walks us through this process for lots of different things that we do every day. It helps us become self-reflective about our own cognitive processes, and then explains what it means that our students also have those same cognitive processes. So, for instance, in this chapter, Willingham walks us through solving a puzzle. He gives us a puzzle and tells us to solve it, and walks us through our cognitive process of solving the puzzle. He walks us through the process of doing mental math. He walks us through the process of driving a car, which hopefully is different from solving a puzzle or mental math. Solving a puzzle or mental math require some thinking, whereas driving a car, if you've been doing it long enough, you shouldn't have to think deeply about what you're going to do next. It should be something that you have all of the procedures and processes highly memorized so that you don't have to do deep thinking about, okay, how much am I going to have to turn the wheel in order to do this? And so Willingham talks about these things, talks about the processes of thinking and also the times where we don't want to be thinking, in order to really fully connect us to the cognitive processes that he's talking about. So the thing is, brains are intelligently lazy. They work really hard at avoiding work, specifically avoiding thinking, because thinking is slow, it requires lots of effort, and it's unreliable. You might not get an answer at all, or you might get an incorrect answer, it's not great. If we can avoid thinking, that would be great. If we already know the answer to a problem, we should avoid doing deep thought about the problem. We should just remember what the answer to the problem is. So brains are designed to avoid the thinking process whenever possible by remembering the answers that we've gotten in the past, with a priority for common tasks that require lots of thought being the most likely to get memorized. So brains try to avoid thinking, but brains also really enjoy thinking as well. So it turns out that solving a problem creates dopamine, which is a chemical involved in all sorts of processes within the brain and the body in general, that some things have nothing to do with cognition. But the key things for cognition is that dopamine is responsible for both reward and learning. The idea here is that if you do something correctly, you want to take all of the neurons that just fired and reinforce the neural connections that caused you to do the thing correctly. So dopamine is responsible partly for that process within the brain. But the key thing is that it's solving the problem that creates dopamine. Working on a problem, that does not create dopamine. Working on a problem is quite unpleasant. And knowing the answer, right, if somebody just told you the answer to a problem that you were working on, that also wouldn't create dopamine. And as somebody with experience in research mathematics, this is something I can highly relate to. The process of working on a research problem is really quite unpleasant and can go on for months or years trying to solve this really difficult problem. But once you solve it, that creates a huge rush of dopamine that makes research mathematics addicting and actually can be kind of unhealthy if you don't manage it properly. So ignoring all extrinsic motivating factors like, oh, you have to solve this problem because it's on the test that you have to do well on, brains will only decide that trying to solve a problem is worth it if it's not too easy, in which case the dopamine reward won't be that great, and also if it's not too hard, in the sense that it's going to require a whole bunch of time and effort investment in order to get the dopamine reward. Brains will kind of try to assess how difficult a problem is, how much the reward will be for that problem, and if it's not at just the right level, they're not going to be motivated by this dopamine reward process to try to work on that problem. And so this has very clear applications to the classroom, that if we want our students to be naturally motivated to do problem solving in the classroom, then we're going to want to very carefully tune the problems that we ask them to solve so that their brains see those problems as worth the effort to solve. But if we can get this tuning just right, our students will be naturally motivated to do this problem solving. We don't have to provide extrinsic motivators, which don't work that well and are actually counterproductive in many cases. We don't have to provide those extrinsic motivators. Students will just be naturally motivated to solve problems, which is part of the learning process. Because again, that dopamine, not only is it part of reward, but it's also part of learning. Once we solve a problem, we remember the answer so that we don't have to solve the problem again. So each chapter ends with some implications for the classroom, things that we can take away from the chapter and use to improve our learning. And this chapter focuses on the question of how to keep our students engaged and enjoying their classes. And the way to do that is to make sure that they are constantly getting that problem-solving dopamine. In order to do that, we really need to take our lesson plans and think about how our students will experience them. And this seems like an obvious thing to do, but it's actually a really tricky process to look at your plans and sit down and think about how your students will experience those plans with what they know and how much preparation they've done, and keeping in mind the variety of students within your classroom. So, for instance, it's really important to make sure that your lesson plan comes with lots of opportunities for students to problem solve so that they get that problem solving dopamine. On the other hand, you do want to be careful not to overload your students with thinking for the entire lesson, because thinking is hard work and they're going to need breaks. They're going to need time where they're just focused on absorbing information or breaks in between activities. And it's important to consider the diversity of students in your classroom. Some of them are going to be really successful at problem solving and they're just going to breeze through the activities that you give them, and others are going to find it very difficult. And so it's important to make sure that as many of your students as possible are able to stay engaged with the activities that you give them and get that problem solving dopamine that comes from successfully solving a problem at their level. The way I deal with this in my classes is to design worksheets that gradually get harder, where the topics that I want all of my students to review are on the front page, and making sure that, in my estimation, all of my students will be able to be successful at solving those problems. And for the students who breeze through the activity, I put more challenging problems towards the end that focus on topics that I want those students to be reviewing. It's important to consider how much information students are going to have to access in order to be successful at solving a particular problem. Do students have that information at all? Is it in their long-term memory and easy to access? Is it something that they've reviewed a bunch? Or is it brand new information that's going to be mostly stored within their short-term memory and therefore take up extra space within their short-term memory and not really be in their long-term memory? Or is this information available in the environment to them? One of the things that you can do to reduce cognitive load, to reduce the amount of stuff that has to be stored in short-term memory at any one time, is to keep useful information on the board while students are working on problems. And you can tune this carefully. If there's new information that you don't expect students have in their long-term memory yet, so when I first introduce the quadratic formula, I'm going to want to put the quadratic formula up on the board so students don't have to right away remember it and keep it in their short-term memory while they're also trying to use their short-term memory to solve problems using the quadratic formula. I'm going to want that information to be available to them in their environment, on the board, ready to access whenever they need it. And that's going to reduce the amount of working memory that's necessary for them to use to solve that problem. And so it means they're more likely to be able to solve that problem. And it's worth noting that neurodiverse students can face additional cognitive load due to whatever form of neurodiversity they might have. And so when I was working with neurodiverse students, our focus was on bringing down cognitive load, even though really what you should be doing is balancing cognitive load, making sure that the cognitive load is at just the right level, that students are kept engaged, that they're not tuning out, but that they also aren't overwhelmed, that they're facing just the right level of cognitive difficulty to keep them invested in getting this problem-solving dopamine. And Willingham has some other implications for the classroom as well, such as focusing our classes around a question as opposed to answers, because questions are engaging. Questions are things that we can apply problem solving to. Answers don't activate this problem solving portion of our brain that gives us dopamine. Of course, we need to wait to pose these questions until students have the right background. They need to see these questions as approachable, things that they can solve, things that make sense in this exchange of problem-solving effort for dopamine. And because of natural variation within our classrooms, this means adapting work level for individual students. Practically speaking, this is a difficult thing to do, but for instance, by having worksheets that gradually get more advanced as you go through, and not expecting students and making sure that they know that they aren't expected to get all the way through those worksheets, you can create activities that naturally adapt themselves for individual students. It's also worth noting that if you're losing students, change in the classroom brings about a small amount of attention to figure out what's going on, and that can be enough to get students who are checked out of a lesson to focus back in on the lesson. So it's important to make sure that your lesson plan involves lots of different things. And finally, because it's really important to make sure that the problems that you pose to students are tuned at just the right level to maintain students' interest without being overwhelming, keep a record from your lessons of what worked well and what didn't work well so that you can fine-tune future lessons to students' levels. Chapter 2 focuses on the importance of factual knowledge, despite it being really easy for students to find whatever factual information they need on the internet, although that's actually gotten a little bit harder nowadays, and it being a common sentiment that schools nowadays shouldn't be teaching students factual knowledge, but rather key skills in taking knowledge in and processing it and using that to solve problems. There's a large reaction against teaching to standardized tests that focus on facts. But Willingham argues that factual knowledge is actually essential to a number of cognitive processes. For instance, knowledge is essential to reading comprehension. Not just the basic knowing what words mean, but actually being able to fill in the gaps, the details that writers don't spell out in their writing. And writers do this all of the time. They identify their audience and make sure not to spell out details that their audience can fill in and would find boring. For instance, when I'm writing a mathematical proof, I need to very carefully consider who my audience is, because there's a lot of details that I could include in my proof, but more advanced audiences might find those details very tedious and automatically know how to fill those details in. On the other hand, for lower level audiences, I'm going to want to fill out more details so they can follow along with the proof, even if they don't have that factual knowledge that's necessary to fill in those details. And when I require students to write proofs, I'm going to ask them to spell out those details so that they can practice, so that they can form the connection in their minds between this stage of a proof and the details that they need to fill in at that stage. Reading is very much an active activity that requires the reader to constantly be problem solving, constantly be filling in details based on their understanding and the context of what they're reading. This book does a really good job of tying in previous chapters, things that we've already focused on learning. For instance, in chapter 2, Willingham looks back to chapter 1 and talks about the role of long-term knowledge in problem solving. And Willingham also looks ahead, for instance, talking about the importance of having this long-term factual knowledge in building expertise. We all have a limited amount of working memory to work with, and it doesn't seem like there's much that can expand the amount of working memory that we have. So we need to find ways of making our use of that working memory more efficient. And one of the ways of doing this is with chunking. If we have background knowledge, we can group commonly grouped pieces of information together. If I know, for instance, that these techniques commonly appear together within a larger mathematical argument, if I see them being used together, I can think of that as a single block within the mathematical argument, and that allows me to keep longer arguments within my head at the same time, because I can think of this entire chunk of the argument as a single piece, taking up one unit as opposed to several units of my working memory. This chunking process also explains how we form new memories. A lot of the time, we are simply taking this information and connecting it to things that we already know. So we have a chunk, we have this new information, and we're just adding on to the chunk, building a bigger chunk. And what that means is that if you know more stuff, if you have more factual knowledge, there's more chunks in your memory to take new information and connect to. Chunking is also very important in problem solving. If we see a particular type of problem and a particular type of solution showing up together often enough, our brains are going to want to combine them together into a single chunk. And so anytime we see a problem of that particular type, we're going to recall this chunk and say, oh, maybe this is the solution technique for this type of problem. So again, we have implications for the classroom. For instance, we need to decide what factual knowledge is important for our students. There's tons of facts within any particular field. How do we decide what are the really important things for students to know, and what are the things that we can actually leave them to look up whenever they need that information? And to answer this question, we need to be thinking about the value of this long-term information in terms of forming connections between this information and other new pieces of information that we want our students to learn in the future. It's also absolutely vital for students to have the necessary background knowledge before you ask them to do critical thinking, before you ask them to do problem solving. It's just going to be frustrating. It's going to seem like not a worthwhile exchange of effort for problem-solving dopamine if students don't feel like they have the necessary long-term knowledge to be able to come up with a meaningful answer to the problem that you pose to them. So make sure that students have that necessary long-term knowledge before you require them to do critical thinking problem solving. And because of the accumulative nature of knowledge formation, because knowledge is very often formed by taking new information and connecting it with information that we already have, small incidental sources of background information are extremely valuable. And this can come through reading of just any sort of reading, or it can come even through, I have gained a whole bunch of incidental geography knowledge from watching people play GeoGuessr online. There's all sorts of ways of acquiring incidental background information, and they're all really valuable for establishing a foundation upon which you can add other knowledge. And again, knowledge is going to stick best when it can be chunked with other pieces of knowledge that students already have. So think about what students already know and try to make connections back to that. Maybe show students that they actually secretly already know how to solve a particular problem. This book, for instance, takes advantage of this principle by first bringing up our past knowledge of how our own thought processes work, things that we've already thought about through self-reflection while we've been thinking or problem solving, to bring up this past knowledge and then take this new cognitive science knowledge and connect it with that past knowledge that we have about our own cognitive processes. And then furthermore, to connect these new teaching lessons to that cognitive science knowledge. It's because the book is forming these connections that we're able to take away so much from it. So chapter 3 asks the question, if it is so important for our students to form long-term memories, how are long-term memories formed? How can we get our students to remember the things that they need to remember in order to build on that and keep learning? First, the information that gets stored in long-term memory has to be processed in short-term memory before it can be stored in long-term memory. So information can't go directly into long-term memory, and it can't just magically appear out of nowhere. It has to get processed in the short-term memory first. And there are a few ways that we think might help form long-term memories, but it turns out that the science says these aren't really the key ways of forming long-term memories. So for instance, strong emotions can improve memory, but they're not the key thing for forming long-term memories, and I don't want my students to be having particularly strong emotions in my classroom, other than maybe math is exciting. But I don't want my students to be really sad about math or anything like that, even if it would help improve their memory. Repetition also isn't enough. It's helpful, but it's not enough to ensure the formation of long-term memories. There are things that we encounter every day that we're not going to remember every single detail about them, even though we encounter those details every day. Wanting to remember also isn't enough, and we know this. If you've ever had a test where you really wanted to remember a particular thing for the test and then forgot it, wanting to remember something alone isn't enough to remember that thing, to have it in long-term memory. And Willingham also talks about artificially working in students' interests to get them engaged, to get them to form connections. But if it's artificial, if these interests don't actually relate to the topic at hand, it risks distracting students from the connections that we would like them to be making, because either they're making connections between these interests and the thing that they're learning, and maybe that connection is artificial. Of course, if it's a real connection, then that's fine. But if it's just made up for the sake of a problem, we don't want that. Or students can get distracted and just zone out and think about their interests and not think about what we're talking about at all. So we really need to be careful about artificially working in students' interests into problems in the classroom. So how are long-term memories formed? Well, here's the key thing, and this is the one thing, if you take nothing else away from this video, this is the one thing that I'd like you to take away from this video, which is that memory is the residue of thought. And it's not simply what you think about that gets remembered. It's the thought process. It's how you think about it. And Willingham talks about lots of specific examples, walking you through experiments that you can perform or experiments that have been performed, and what exactly that means when we look at it from this perspective. So for instance, if you make change a lot involving pennies, you have a very strong memory that pennies are worth 1 cent, because that is the thing that you processed when you were working with those pennies. But when you were making change with those pennies, you were not thinking about the precise look of the penny. You weren't thinking about all of the details that are on a penny and where they are relative to each other. And so Willingham shows you this experiment that you can try, where he gives you a bunch of different pictures of what could be pennies and asks you to pick out the real one. What words are where on the penny, for instance. And because you weren't thinking about those aspects of the penny, you weren't thinking about those details when you were working with the penny, even though you may have seen lots of pennies within your lifetime, even though you may have lots of repetition, you weren't processing those specific features, and so you didn't remember them as well. Willingham also talks about some experiments that have been performed. For instance, he talks about word recall experiments where subjects are given a list of words that they have to remember. And when subjects were given the list of words that they had to remember, whether or not they were asked to perhaps think about the meaning of the word, which formed more connections within their mind, versus just the letters of the word, which would form fewer connections within their mind, this had an impact on how much people remembered the words. Because it wasn't just the words that were being remembered, it was the whole thought process. And when the thought process is more, when it connects more parts of the brain, it's more likely to be recalled. And it's specific aspects of meaning that get remembered. So, for instance, one word recall test had words within sentences that were highlighted that the subjects had to remember. So, for instance, they might have the word piano within a sentence about how heavy a piano is. And later on, those subjects were prompted with a hint to help remind them of the word that they were supposed to remember. And if that hint agreed with the meaning of the word, the aspect of meaning of the word in the original sentence, so if the hint asked, oh, it's the heavy thing, and the original sentence was prompted about pianos being heavy, then subjects were more likely to remember it than if the hint was, oh, it's a musical thing, if the original sentence didn't include piano as a musical thing. So it's not just the word that was encountered, but it was the way in which the subjects were prompted to think about the word, the connections that were being formed that got remembered. So what does this mean for teaching? Well, a really good way to get students actively engaged in a class is by telling stories, because stories actually require a lot of cognitive engagement to fill in the details. Good stories engage the audience at exactly the right level of problem solving. Remember that brains really like problems that are just the right level, not too easy, not too hard, to just give that little kick of dopamine for not too much of an effort. And filling in the gaps of a story, filling in the details that don't get really explicitly spelled out, can be, if properly tuned, just the right level of engagement. And of course, how much I can expect the audience to be able to fill in gaps, what level of cognitive engagement that's going to be, depends on the audience. So what makes stories really good at being cognitively engaging is that they are causal. Stories are supposed to make sense, and because of that, there's kind of a hint. Everything in this story is there for a purpose. Which, this isn't, I mean, like, the real world doesn't actually work this way, and this is actually one of the complaints that I have about stories, is that they are artificially causal, where there's a lot of just, like, random stuff that happens in the universe. But because stories are artificially causal, we know that every aspect of the story is part of a chain, and that gives us a hint that helps us to fill in the gaps of the story. Why is this piece here? It has to be important, and that's a hint that it's going to be important in forming the connections of the story. If there are characters in a story, we can also think about those characters' motivations. And again, understanding those, even though real-world people aren't as straightforwardly motivated as characters within a story, having characters that have motivations that are relevant to the story gives us a hint as to how to put things together. So it's this filling in the gaps process. It's the fact that people are cognitively engaged with the story, and they're filling in the gaps, and they're thinking about the gaps, that produces memories of the story, that makes stories so memorable. So what does this mean for our lesson? Well, you want to organize your lessons to form good stories. And even if it's a math lesson, you can still make a story out of it by starting off with a question to say, here's a thing you might be curious about, and really motivate the question. Spend lots of time setting up the question, because answers by themselves, not very exciting, hard to remember. But if you have this chain of memories from questions that are possibly based on things that students are already asking themselves, to how we should be thinking about things in order to answer the question, to the answer to the question, if we have this kind of narrative going through the lesson, that's really valuable and it's much easier to remember. So what does this mean for our teaching? Well, again, the key thing, evaluate your lessons by thinking through your students' thought processes. What are the things that are going to be going through your students' heads while they work on a particular assignment? You might have students, I don't know, make a diorama or something, and ask yourself, while they're making that diorama, are they going to be thinking about the things that you want them to be thinking about from the lesson, or are they going to be more focused on the process of making the diorama? You need to make sure that the meaning, the key lessons that you want to get across to students, are actually part of the thought processes that students are going through when they engage with the assignment. Also, we should be really careful with attention grabbers. So for instance, say that you're teaching a chemistry class and you do a really exciting chemistry experiment. Think about what's going on in students' heads while you're doing this demonstration. Do they know enough background to be able to think about what's happening? Or otherwise you risk just distracting students. And this actually makes things worse because while you're doing the lesson, they might be thinking about the attention grabber. They might be distracted from the lesson that comes after the really exciting experiment. Willingham also cautions us to be really careful with discovery learning, and this is actually an issue very much in mathematics, where if students do something wrong, they will remember the wrong way of doing it. If students have a false piece of knowledge and build off of it, they risk cementing that false knowledge in their long-term memory. So it's really important to give students immediate feedback on their work, to make sure that if students make a mistake, you are telling them right away so that they can correct themselves and don't risk building off of this wrong, either procedural or factual knowledge. And again, Willingham really suggests that we organize lessons around questions, not answers. We should start with what are the answers? What are the things that we want students to know? But then work backwards to figure out what are the questions that lead to those answers, and structure the lesson so that it's mostly about the question and the process of leading up to that answer. Not every chapter of Willingham's book is about the question that forms the title of that chapter. For instance, chapter 4 claims to be about abstract ideas, but what it's really about is establishing deep knowledge within our students. So when we want our students to understand an abstract idea, the way that they're going to understand it is in terms of concrete examples and being able to connect that abstract idea to those concrete examples. So what we're really looking for our students to do is to build up this elaborate network of examples which are then related to a single abstraction, and to understand exactly how the relationship works between the abstraction and the examples, exactly what corresponds to what in these various examples. So not only do they have to form the connection between the abstraction and the examples, but it has to be a rich connection. There has to be additional information associated with that connection. There have to be connections between the examples so that students can compare and contrast the different examples, and students should also have some information about how to identify new instances of those abstractions. This is asking a whole lot of students, but it is something that we can do if we're patient and careful about how we build up this large web of knowledge. So Willingham suggests, in order to introduce a new concept, bring up older concepts from long-term memory, make sure that students are ready to access those, point out the important aspects of those concepts, and point out what's unimportant about those concepts. What are the things that we're going to be focusing on when we're talking about why this concrete example is an instance of this more abstract phenomenon? And make connections between the abstract phenomenon and the example. And then do this a whole bunch. Establish lots of different examples of this more abstract phenomenon and form those connections. And form connections between the examples so that students can compare and contrast those examples. So if we're looking for students to have deep knowledge about a particular subject, what we're really looking for them to have is a large web that they can form lots of new connections with involving that subject. What does this mean for the classroom? Well, one of the things that's really important is that you have students compare and connect and contrast various examples of a single abstraction that you're trying to get students to understand. To understand, why do these examples look this way? Why does that example look that way? By doing that connection between examples, that just makes the web of connections more robust. We also need to be careful about the hidden lessons that we teach in the classroom. Sure, we can be explicit about saying, I want you to establish deep knowledge about this topic. But then if deep understanding isn't part of your assessment, that kind of takes away from the message, right? Students will get the message that actually this deep knowledge isn't important because it isn't showing up on the assessments. So we need to be really careful about not just the explicit messages that we send about the importance of deep knowledge, but also about the hidden messages in the way that we design our classes. It's also super important to understand deep knowledge requires tons of connections. This takes a lot of time to establish. This isn't something that you can just tell a person a particular abstraction and be done with it. If you want students to have deep knowledge, it really has to be a large web of connections. And so we should be realistic in our expectations of students. They're not going to be able to get these deep connections immediately, and in the process, while they're forming this network, it may be a little bit weak. They may have just the abstraction connected to a single example, and so they might not be able to compare and contrast different examples yet. Chapter 5 talks about the importance of reviewing after students become proficient in a particular task. Of course, reviewing is important to become proficient in that particular task, but what about once students have become proficient, do they still need to review? And the answer is yes. So suppose I have two different students in my calculus class, and they both can demonstrate complete proficiency in algebra, a prerequisite skill for calculus. But one of those students requires a lot of working memory in order to solve a particular algebra problem, whereas the other student has reviewed algebra even further and requires much less working memory in order to do basic algebraic manipulations. So both of these students will be able to demonstrate the same level of proficiency in algebra, but the student who requires more working memory to do algebra parts of a problem are going to have less working memory left over to think about the role of calculus in a particular problem. So in calculus, the sorts of problems that you have involve both calculus parts and algebra parts. And if students are using up a lot of working memory for the algebra parts, they're not going to have working memory left over to be reflective about how the calculus parts are related to each other, how they form a structure in the argument, what sorts of calculus steps are often followed by other calculus steps. Those sorts of considerations are going to be jettisoned in order to focus on solving the problem. Whereas a student who doesn't need to spend as much working memory on the algebra parts of the calculus problem can spend their leftover working memory on seeing patterns within arguments, seeing how different steps of a calculus argument are related to each other, for instance. So that student is going to be able to learn a lot more, even though they look identical in terms of how they would perform on an algebra proficiency test. Review also helps students avoid forgetting particular topics. If a student continues to use their algebra skills in further math and other courses, they're going to remember those skills, whereas students who don't use their math skills, even if they performed just as well when they initially learned them, are not going to retain those math skills. So it's very important to review in order to prevent forgetting. And of course, Willingham heavily advises against cramming for assessments because it's not nearly as effective a type of review as spaced out review. So what are the implications for the classroom? Well, it turns out practice is boring, and students are already doing a lot of practice in order to develop basic proficiency in the skills that we're trying to get them to develop proficiency in. So are we also going to ask them to practice skills that they have already been able to demonstrate proficiency in? Well, yes, but we want to be careful about which skills we ask our students to practice. Practice is boring, so we just need to focus on those skills that we want to become automatic in our students, because those skills are going to be things that we want students to be able to do quickly while they're doing other stuff later on in their academic career. It's also important to space out this practice. Space it out throughout the semester. If there's a particular skill, make sure that at various points throughout the semester, students have opportunities to practice that skill. If you have the ability to do so, shuffle around the topics in your class to make sure that important skills are being practiced every so often. One of the nice things about teaching math courses is that because a lot of skills build on top of previous skills, more advanced topics will often necessitate review of simpler previous topics. So for instance, when I ask my students to solve equations by factoring, they'll need to review their factoring skills, and they'll also need to review their factoring integer skills. So not just factoring polynomials, but also factoring integers, because that's a key skill that's part of factoring polynomials. So it's very often the case, at least in mathematics, that you can work in practice of previous skills into your more advanced topics. A common complaint, and I imagine things are similar in other fields about lower-level mathematics courses, is that the stuff that we expect our lower-level math students to do is very different from what expert mathematicians wind up doing. Don't we want our students thinking like research mathematicians? In fact, graduate mathematics courses don't even look like what expert research mathematicians do. The sorts of problems that show up in a graduate mathematics course are solvable, and you know that they're solvable because they've been assigned for homework, and you know that they're solvable in a couple of weeks, and that they're probably solvable using the tools that you've used in the course, and nothing completely surprising that your professor couldn't expect you to know about. On the other hand, research mathematics, the sorts of problems that you deal with in research mathematics, there's no guarantee at all that they're even solvable. It may be the case that there is literally no solution to the problem that you're working on. It may be the case that it would take 100 years worth of dedicated study of dozens of mathematicians in order to be able to solve the problem that you're working on. And it may be the case that the tools necessary to solve the problem that you're working on are just completely out of left field. So why don't we expect our students, along their paths to become experts, to think and work like experts? Well, my calculus students don't have the broad interconnected web of knowledge necessary to think like expert mathematicians. We need to establish this broad interconnected web of knowledge before we can expect them to think like experts. So how do experts think? Well, experts are very good at identifying which details are important. Experts can face problems that have lots of different pieces of information and identify what they need to be focusing on and what pieces of information are going to be unimportant. They can take their skills and transfer them to similar domains, and as we've mentioned before, with enough practice, common skills are going to become automatic. They're not going to take up any space at all within working memory. So what do you have to do in order to become an expert? Well, you need to do about 10 years worth of practice. That's a rough number, but it seems to be about the right number for a lot of different things. And what's going on here during those 10 years of practice is that these experts are forming this complicated web of knowledge, of interconnections between different aspects of a particular topic, and understanding how they're related to each other, and internalizing a wide variety of critical problem-solving techniques. So what does this mean for the classroom? Well, it's unrealistic to get our students to think like experts right away. We shouldn't be trying to teach our students to become experts. It turns out that the journey from not knowing something to being an expert in a particular field is a varying journey. And this journey can go back and forth. The journey to being an expert mathematician oscillates frequently between being able to spell out all of the details of an argument and being able to understand what are the details of an argument that we don't need to spell out because we can expect other experts to be able to fill in those gaps. And so there's a back and forth journey between wanting students to make highly detailed arguments and less detailed arguments, and then being able to make highly detailed arguments at a higher level that build off of those less detailed arguments at a lower level, and then going back and forth. This journey is not a straight line. So what should we be focusing on when we teach our students? Well, we should be focusing on teaching topics, and if we're interested in teaching students what a particular field looks like, to just teach them that content, to say, hey, this is what experts in this particular field wind up doing, as opposed to trying to get our students to think like experts. In particular, we shouldn't really expect our students, except at the most advanced levels, to be creating their own knowledge. This isn't to say that we should entirely give up on having our students act like experts within the classroom. We might, for instance, in an advanced science class, have our students design experiments. But it's important to think carefully about what students will be able to take away from these activities. They might not be able to see the complete picture the way an expert in the field would. And again, it's important to note that the path to expertise isn't direct. It isn't a straight line from A to B. Early practice in a particular field may look very different from later practice in that field, even if this is the best path from novice to expert. A common misconception in teaching is that different students have different learning styles, and Willingham specifies exactly what the hypothesis of the existence of learning styles really means. It means that different students have different ways of learning, and that there are matching teaching styles, and if we take any topic and match the way that we teach it with our students' learning styles, those students will do better, and students whose learning styles aren't matched will do worse. But it turns out that there's no strong evidence out there for the existence of learning styles. Yes, it's true that people do differ in their ability to remember different types of information. Some people might be better at remembering visual information, and some people might be better at remembering auditory information. But the evidence just isn't there that changing up our teaching style to either be more visual or more auditory would actually improve these students' retention of information. It turns out that most information has a natural form that it takes, and when people have to remember information, regardless of the form that you present it in, it has to get translated into its natural form to be stored. So a student's memory style is actually going to affect what topics they're able to remember better rather than what types of lessons they're able to remember better. So what does this mean for the classroom? Well, it means that we shouldn't be changing up our teaching modalities in order to match our students' ideal learning styles. We should instead be focusing on the modality or modalities that a topic is best presented in. If something is best presented visually, present it visually. It's also really valuable to change up the way that you teach particular topics. Changing the ways that you present information within a class from auditory to visual to interactive keeps students engaged. Remember that changing things up can help regain students' attention and also help students practice different types of mental processes. Finally, Willingham has a very important complaint to make about reasoning about intelligence. Very often, people will want to see value in intelligence, but what this actually implies is that a lack of intelligence makes a person less valuable, and that's a terrible thing to imply or think. What are you doing? Don't do that. All people have inherent value, and it's really hurtful to say that some people have more value than others. So let's talk about intelligence research. So it turns out that there is a correlation between performance on different types of intelligence tests. Cognitive scientists describe this phenomenon in terms of a particular value called G, standing for general intelligence. But it's also the case that there's a stronger correlation among intelligence tests of the same type. For instance, students who do well on a verbal intelligence test are likely to do well on a mathematical test as well, but they are more likely to do well on another verbal test. And Willingham talks about the types of research that has been done into intelligence. It seems like both genetics and environment have a huge impact on individuals' performance on intelligence tests. And the theory that Willingham cites to explain this is that it may be that the effect of genetics is being magnified due to environmental feedback loops. Individuals who demonstrate proficiency in a particular skill tend to seek out environments where they can continue practicing that skill. And so if a student is a little bit ahead in terms of their schoolwork, they're likely to want to seek out ways of developing those skills, and students who are a little bit behind are going to want to check out of their classes. This theory suggests that it's really important that we tune our classes to be just the right level of challenge for all of our individual students. If all of our students can experience the same level of success as is usually reserved for just those at the highest level, then more of our students are likely to seek out building their academic skills. And this fits into the idea of a growth mindset. Students who have a growth mindset, who believe that intelligence is malleable and that they can improve their performance on intelligence assessments, wind up getting higher grades because they're motivated to put in the work. It's necessary to put in work in order to improve your skills, in order to practice. And students who believe that putting in that work will help them become successful are more likely to perform well. Students who have a fixed mindset, on the other hand, that is, that they believe that intelligence is immutable, that everybody has a certain level of intelligence and that's it, there's nothing you can do about it, may avoid putting in work. They might not see it as a worthwhile expenditure of effort because these students don't believe that they can improve by putting in that work. Another thing that Willingham points out is that these students with a fixed mindset might also want to avoid putting in work because they feel like the appearance of putting in work makes them look unintelligent. After all, in their model of the world, intelligent people don't have to put in work in order to be successful, and unintelligent people do have to put in work in order to be successful. So they will want to avoid being associated with unintelligent people. Again, remember, in their minds, there does exist a notion of intelligent and unintelligent people because they have this fixed mindset. These individuals are not going to want to appear unintelligent as part of some complicated social signaling stuff. And one of the things that we know about growth mindsets is that the way that we act within our classrooms helps students develop their ideas about how knowledge works. So if we praise our students with things like, "Oh, you must be really smart," well, that fits in with the idea of a fixed mindset, and it's going to help cement a fixed mindset within our students. And that's something that we don't want. On the other hand, if we praise our students by saying that they must have put a lot of work into learning something, that can help establish within them a growth mindset. We also need to think carefully about other aspects of our classes that portray ways that intelligence might work. For instance, it's important to make sure that your grading systems correctly represent the idea that measuring students' proficiency in the skills that we're trying to test might be very different at different parts of the semester because they can learn a thing between your first assessment of that topic and later assessments of that topic. This can lead into establishing a standards-based grading system, which is an entirely separate video. So what does this mean for the classroom? Well, it's important to be careful about how we praise our students. Praise their effort, not their ability. We can also provide students with explicit instruction that putting in work will help them improve. Explicitly telling students about the growth mindset and how it works and how it can help students improve their performance is actually effective. It's also really important to fit in with this idea of a growth mindset that we accept and recognize that students will start off not being able to do the skills that we expect of them at the end of the course. We need to embrace failure as part of the learning process. Getting problems wrong is an absolutely essential part of any class, and we should make sure that the systems that we set up in our class embrace failure. And don't say, "Oh, if you fail on this, well then you're going to fail the class." That's not embracing failure. That's not a good way of showing students that we expect them to go from not knowing how to do something to knowing how to do it. Study skills are also essential. They're a great way to get students off of a failure and demotivation feedback loop into a success and motivation feedback loop. So if you have the time, make sure that students have the necessary study skills. Each different field, each different course is going to require studying in slightly different ways, so take the time to demonstrate to your students how to study for your course. It's also important to set reasonable expectations for students who need to catch up. Set small intermediate goals. If you require a student to do an immense amount of work in order to catch up, either if they've missed class or have fallen behind in class, if you require them to do an immense amount of work to get caught back up right away, they're probably going to experience failure in that, and that can get them on a fixed mindset feedback loop or a failure demotivation feedback loop. So set smaller, reasonable goals for students who need to catch up so that they can feel successful and get on a success motivation feedback loop. Also, it's important to hold students to identical high standards. If you set different standards for different students in terms of their eventual ability to demonstrate proficiency within the course, that doesn't demonstrate confidence in your lower level performing students' abilities. It's going to reinforce a fixed mindset that those students are going to believe that they are unable to eventually reach the high standards that you set for the higher performing students. Finally, in Chapter 9, Willingham talks about what we can learn from cognitive science about our own brains that can help us improve our practice of teaching. For instance, Willingham talks about the importance of practice, and here he makes the distinction between practice and mere repetition. Practice requires careful thought and knowledgeable feedback. And Willingham provides a plan for teachers to review their teaching and get knowledgeable feedback in a way that's as painless as possible. He suggests that we begin by taping our classes and observing our tapes to get used to seeing ourselves teach. And then only once we've gotten used to this process to bring in a partner and to begin practicing providing feedback on teaching videos by comparing tapes of a separate teacher's classes, and to practice providing helpful feedback to those videos so that you don't have to right away worry about are you providing helpful or hurtful feedback to the person you're watching the videos with. Then, once both of you feel comfortable in your ability to give and receive feedback, then go over together your own tapes of your classes. And finally, slowly bring back insights that you've gained from these discussions into your practice. Don't try to do everything all at once. And as we've talked about before, practicing beyond proficiency is really important for reducing load on working memory and building long-term knowledge. And that can be the working memory that you spend while you're teaching. That can be the long-term knowledge that you have about teaching techniques. Willingham also has some advice for teachers who want to make changes to the way that they teach. Much of our problem-solving processes have been shifted from our working memory to our long-term memory, as we've automated many of our problem-solving techniques. When you change up how you teach, these automated processes aren't going to be helpful, and so you'll find yourself using more of your working memory while you teach. Recall that problem-solving using your working memory requires more energy than simply remembering how to solve particular problems. That's why it's so important to work in breaks between problem-solving sessions for your students. It's important to plan for this extra energy expenditure. You'll want to find time in your schedule not just for the extra work that you want to do to improve your teaching, but also for extra relaxation, to balance out the extra energy that you're expending while you teach. Being able to account for this extra energy expenditure is vital to staying motivated when making changes to your classes. So take it slow, anticipate the extra time and energy it will take to make these changes, and don't feel like you have to change everything all at once. And Willingham also talks about some smaller steps that you can take if you're not ready to make radical changes to your teaching. Keeping a teaching diary is very valuable to keep track of what works and what doesn't work, to keep track of lessons that you've learned. Sometimes it's as simple as writing something that you've learned down that helps you remember it. You don't even have to go back to it, but it's useful to have something that you can go back to as reference. It might be helpful to start a discussion group with fellow teachers. This is great just for the social benefit alone, having other people you can vent to if things are going poorly, but it's also great for problem solving and for sparking ideas. And finally, it's useful to be able to get inside your students' heads, to understand what they're thinking about. Especially nowadays when technology is changing so rapidly, it's really important to keep track of what do students' worlds even look like with the technology they're using. So it's valuable to observe your students' peers outside of the classroom, whether this is out in the world or online. So I hope you've enjoyed this summary of Willingham's book, Why Don't Students Like School? And I hope you've taken away something that you can use in your own teaching. I definitely recommend picking up the book yourself. There are so many explicit walkthroughs of situations and thought processes in the book that I haven't been able to include in this video, that those alone are really valuable for helping you self-reflect and understand these cognitive processes and how they're connected to our own teaching practices. But I think the most valuable thing to take away from the book is this idea of thinking about your classes from your students' perspective with your understanding of how cognition works. Classes are a journey. You are taking your students on a journey, and you need to think about how your students are going to see that journey, what it's going to be like for them, going from not knowing something to knowing something. And this is a very difficult thing to do because we know the thing that we're trying to empathize with somebody who doesn't know the thing yet. It was very challenging as somebody who's been doing algebra for decades to try to relate to somebody who is just beginning their algebra journey. And so just as it is with video games or making YouTube videos, it's important to think about the experience your audience will have and the cognitive processes that go along with that. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video.